Welcome to Biocomputation with Dr. Max. Today I want to talk about currencies, specifically how metal beats paper, and summarize the experience of perhaps 1500 years of major regions in the world that have implemented both representative metal currencies and fiat paper currencies, namely Asia and China, as well as the West. To give a preview of this discussion, metal currencies have supported 5 dynasties in China sequentially, and also contemporaneously have supported 5 different nations, empires in the West. When switching to paper currency, the Chinese have experienced the downfall of 5 sequential dynasties that have adopted paper currency after they've basically abandoned their invention of cash, the bronze coins. And so has the West faced downfall with transition from representative metal to fiat paper currency. And I'll have a separate video on that. The other ones I already covered in videos with links in the reference below. But the downfall of the West is primarily centered around World War I, and that'll be covered in a separate video. But here, let me briefly go through these experiences. As I mentioned, there were 5 dynasties in China that were supported by cash coins, specifically the Wuzhou coin, that outlasted these 5 dynasties over 700 years. And here they are: the Han Dynasty, the 3 kingdoms, the Northern and Southern dynasties, the Jin Dynasty, and the Sui Dynasty. What's important about this is that there was a lot of change, obviously, happening within China. It was unified, it fragmented further, it became unified, and then it was taken over by another dynasty. And throughout all those changes, the Wuzhou coins were used. And then the Tang Dynasty came. They invented paper currency for private, basically, institutions. And then they were institutionalized under the Song. And there the trouble started. So here we have a summary of 5 sequential dynasties in China that were destroyed by paper currencies. And there are some wonderful quotes in a video I recently posted on how the Yuan have this dynasty destroyed China by their current paper currency. So this experience for nearly 700 years was so impactful for the Chinese that the Qing dynasty avoided paper currency except for some rebellions where it was forced to issue it as an emergency. But otherwise, it stayed away from it until the very end of the 19th century, when, of course, it was a week after essential accumulation, and perhaps the reintroduction of paper currency was the final straw that broke the camel's back. The positive example of the Western currencies that I've went over in detail in another video, here I will be brief, includes the Roman denarius, which lasted for 450 years, the Byzantine solidus, which outlasted the Western Roman Empire and lasted at least 780, the Venetian ducat, the British pound, and let's say for rounding out the 5, the Russian ruble, which of course started as bricks of silver, not coins, and they were chopped. So that's what ruble means. It's basically a chop, a piece. And of course, here I show the US dollar experience, which was also backed by precious metals, generously putting it for 179 years. But as I'm hinting, the purchasing power of the dollars, we know, has waned significantly since its introduction. Here's one graphical representation of that. Here's my kind of interpretation of it, with the value represented by gold pouring out of the bucket full of dollars. And in fact, when we look at it specifically from what I was saying the final point of disconnection between gold backing and US dollar in 1971 under President Nixon, when he stopped reimbursing foreign countries for paper currency with gold. That transaction for US citizens was no longer possible after 1933, but for foreign nations, central banks, it was available until 1971. And if we look at the price of gold then and now, we can see that perhaps 1.2% remained as of the end of 2025. And of course, we know what's happening to the price of gold. It has more than doubled in the last, 2.5 years. The final illustration here is of the Western empires that fell as they disconnected their currency from precious metals. And as I mentioned, that coincided with war, as these things have for the Chinese dynasties that fell in sequence. The war necessitates expenditure, and there's insufficient species, and there's insufficient precious metal, so they either dilute it, as the Romans did, or they go to fiat currency printing, as was done by the Chinese, and they have experienced that hundreds of years before the Europeans, and it was all extremely detrimental. And this was the case for 5 empires that fell together at the same time around World War I. One of them you could argue about, but let me go through this list here. The German Reich, they had different types of backing of their currency, but since Bismarck, perhaps they had maybe the shortest run of their currency. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had a longer backing of their currency by silver than gold, and they stopped that backing at the beginning of World War I, as did the Turkish Empire, which of course conquered Constantinople, and they had their currency supported by silver and gold for over 600 years in total. The Russian Empire did not end pegged to precious metal in the beginning of the war, but towards the end, right at the time of the revolution. And the British pound also was disconnected from gold in 1914. It was finally disconnected in 1931. It's an interesting little detail that I mentioned in the more elaborative video, that both the Russians under Stalin and the British under the head of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, from around 1925 to 1931, attempted to bring back the gold peg, but they failed. And there are limitations with gold. It's a great store of value, but it's perhaps limiting and now anachronistic. But nevertheless, we can see very clear distinction between the longevity of nations and dynasties that stuck to valuable representation of their currency and those that have abandoned it.